I'm going to give you a short lecture this morning on the subject of long-term memory. Particularly, I'm going to be talking about how information can be gotten into long-term memory so it can be retrieved and understood. In order to be able to use long-term memory effectively as a holder of information, you need to be able to get information into long-term memory, and then you need to be able to find it when you need it, like you would if you were taking a test. You remember back in Module 1, we talked about the model of the brain and what goes on in the brain while learning is taking place. If you recall, information came in through the receptors, the eyes and the ears, passed on to the sensory register, where some of the information was screened out. What went through the sensory register went into short-term or working memory, and from there, under the influence of various processes called executive control processes, that information went on into long-term memory. And those same processes were used to get information out of long-term memory so that you were able to use it. So keep that in mind when we talk about long-term memory, because we will be talking about that very process. The most important concept that you need to know when we talk about long-term memory is the concept of the schema. A schema, and that's like the word scheme, but with an A at the end, S-C-H-E-M-A, schema. A schema is a way of classifying information that's in long-term memory. It's like a folder on a computer, or a folder in a drawer where you keep folders, or an index card in an index card file. If your mother had an index card file and kept recipes on it, then those recipes would be like schema. They would be instructions for doing something. What do I do in a particular situation to get a particular outcome? If I want to make meatloaf, what ingredients do I take, and what do I do with them in what order in order to have the end result be a meatloaf? And so that's the schema. And what we believe is that it's this sort of thing, these schemas that exist in long-term memory, and it's into schemas that we place information, and from schemas that we retrieve information. So there are lots of examples of schemas. You have a schema, for example, for doing laundry. You have a schema for solving equations, how you go about doing it. You have a social schema, what to do at a party or at a dance. You have, if you happen to work out, you have a schema. If you're in an aerobics class, you have a schema for what the pattern of movements are during that class. And if you're in that class and you don't know the pattern of movements, you don't have the schema, then you're completely out of phase with everybody else. You are learning in many schema in this class, but right now you're learning the schema of how to take notes. So those are some examples. But particularly what I want to talk about and describe to you very briefly are four important processes that help us get information into long-term memory. And these are the processes that are important to use in order to make it possible for you to get information into and retrieve information from long-term memory. Of course, being able to do that will help you considerably when it comes to taking a test. Because when you take a test, the only information that is available to you is the information that you carry into the test in your own head. So all the notes in the world aren't going to help. You need to actually get that information into long-term memory. The first of those four processes is called abstracting. What abstracting means is picking out from among all of the information that which is important. If you're having a test on a chapter, and the chapter is 20 pages long, there's no way that you're going to get 20 pages of information into long-term memory. You're only going to get a small fraction of that information into long-term memory, and you have to be selective in terms of what information you choose to get into long-term memory. So that's abstracting. Now the question is, what is it that you should be looking for? What is the important information? And the important information is represented by the main ideas. You're looking for the main ideas. How do you find the main ideas? Well, the way you find the main ideas, and you'll learn a lot more about this when you get into the next module, in learning from text. But I can tell you now that in the textbook, you find the main ideas in the headings, for example, the headings of the chapters, the headings of the sections. Information that's presented in italics, information that's presented in boldface, items in a list or bulleted items are made to stand out. Those are generally important. And other than all of those things, and if all else fails, you may say the most important place to look for the main idea is in the first sentence of the paragraph. Generally, a well-written book, the first sentence of the paragraph will contain the main idea. Now, when you abstract, when you listen to a lecture, you're also engaging in abstracting. You're not writing down. If you were taking notes now, and presumably you are, you're not going to be writing down every word that comes out of my mouth. You couldn't write fast enough, and it wouldn't be anything that you could probably read or even translate. So you're abstracting, you're making decisions about what's important, and you're trying to select the things, and you're listening for the same kinds of cues. When I say something in a certain way with a certain amount of emphasis, in effect, that's like italics or like a boldface or like a heading. And so you're able to detect that and write that down. When you do that, you're abstracting. So that's important because of the capacity of long-term memory. While it is huge, the problem, of course, is finding things. And you don't want to put more in there than you're ever going to be able to look through, in a sense, scan through mentally. The second process, important process, is called schematizing. Since the schema is the basic unit, schematizing means putting the information that you get into schema, into these folders, into these locations. Just like in your house, you put things in different drawers. In your kitchen, you put the plates in one place and the glasses in the other, and so on and so forth. In your drawers, in your closets, in your drawers, you may put the socks in one place and the shirts in another. We need different places in long-term memory in which to put information. One way to do schematizing is to put information in places that represents what that information has to tell you. For example, one folder, one category, one schema could be definitions and descriptions. So, for example, if you were learning about red blood cells, the definition and description of the red blood cell would go into that particular schema, that particular folder. Another important one is cause and effect. What causes what it is that you're learning about to change, and what happens when it does change? What impact does it have? Cause and effect. So what makes for more red blood cells, and what happens if you have too few red blood cells or too many? That would go into that folder. Then you could have another folder that would be comparison and contrast. Like, for example, what are the difference between red blood cells and white blood cells? And what functions do they carry out that differ, and so on. You could have one on examples and illustrations of what it is that you're learning about. You could have one on sequence. What are the sequence of steps that occurs in the red blood cell transporting oxygen through the body? Those represent some of the categories that you can use for schematizing. So that's the second important process. The third important process is called elaborating. Elaborating means adding something to the information, not just taking the information, lifting it out of the text or the lecture and trying to get it into long-term memory, but adding something that is unique to you, that's your idea. Putting things in your own words, for example, would be one way of elaborating. In this course, as you are finding out and will continue to find out, the major form of elaborating that we are teaching you is to be able to write questions that connect to the information that you're learning. When you write a question, you are adding something to the information. What you're adding is your key to get to that information, and that's the advantage of elaborating. Another useful way to elaborate, to find a way to get to that information in long-term memory, is to use examples. If you can make up an example of something, what is an example of a red blood cell? Or thinking about maybe a time that you were high up in a mountain, you found it hard to breathe, and you realized that your red blood cell count was going down, and because it carries oxygen, it was hard for you to breathe. That example is an elaboration and can help you remember what red blood cells are, for example, and what they do. So that's the third important process. The fourth important process, the last one, is organizing. Organizing is putting the information into some sort of form or order. Generally, we use things like outlines to organize information. That's a useful way of doing it. In the next module, you will learn a way of writing outlines to organize information from text. But another really useful way to organize information is visually, in the form of charts or diagrams. In Module 8, you will learn a lot about diagrams and charts that you can use for organizing information visually that will make it very, very helpful for you in getting information into and getting information out of long-term memory, which is exactly what we're talking about. So those are the four: abstracting, schematizing, elaborating, and organizing, and they each have their way of being carried out, and they each have their value.